Meanwhile, on the comic box, October is here, and that means spooky things. Ba-da-bow, bop-doo, dibba-da-bow, dibba-da-bow, dum-dum-dum, doo comics. Hello, everyone, and welcome to issue 68 of the comic box. That's right, I said 66 last time, because I was wrong. This is issue 68 of the comic box, part of the Geek to Geek podcast network. I am Rob, your friendly neighborhood comic geek, and Liam was supposed to join me. I actually just got off the phone with him. He has to go to his girlfriend's sister's birthday party and somehow misunderstood my message about using our cell phones to hear one another. Oh, look, it's that manual thing. Fletch, I don't care if you're listening. You ruined everything as I explain everything going on behind the scenes. The point is, it's just me this week, and I want to talk about horror comic books and horror adaptations. So first, let's get into the weekly geekery with a The main thing I have done this week that is geeky applies to the thing we're talking about this week. I did a big horror comic reread, so I'm trying to think what else I have done really beyond that. I've been watching more of The Office with the wife. I'm not quite sure if she's still enjoying it. It's a show that, again, you're kind of going backwards going to that from Parks and Rec, which she absolutely loves. Besides that, I did go down to the haunted house, the Circle of Ash haunted house in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or north of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, last weekend. Had an absolute blast. It was the opening night. It was rather slow, but the position I took up in the haunt was towards the end of one of their 3 attractions, because this is on its way to becoming a genuine scream park, if you get the pun. The idea being you don't just go through the one haunted house. They have the main haunted house, they have a haunted forest section you walk through, and then they have this giant maze filled with fog and clowns, and then there are rides as well, where you sit in a large wooden box, and there's pneumatic, I guess, pistons or whatever under you, and the thing jerks back and forth in time to the audio you're listening to. And I did the audio for one of those, so I finally got to hear it, even though it's been like a year and a half since I did the audio. So that was rewarding. It was very cool. I enjoyed it. So that was a blast. I had a really good time and got to see some people I only see once a year. And that's pretty much it. I saw The Conjuring 2. I don't know if that was last week or this week. And that was good. You know, I'm trying to figure out, I have friends on Facebook that are doing this 31 and 31 thing where they're trying to watch 31 horror films in October, in the 31 days of October. And I just don't know if that's the sort of thing that I can handle. That's just a lot of movies. So I'm thinking probably not. I listened to the most recent episode of Tea Time with Katie and Chelsea, where they started talking about their favorite franchises. Big over-the-air high five for talking about Nightmare on Elm Street. It's one of my favorite horror film franchises, and for giving a special shout-out to this show. And I'm also really happy to hear that Chelsea started reading Giant Days and got through the first 2 volumes and enjoyed it. I have read some Giant Days myself, but again, that was last week. So let's get into news. I actually have a couple of news pieces for you guys. So we'll go news. So very quickly, a couple of quick news bits. The first one, if you recall a couple episodes ago, there was a big reveal in DC Comics where Batman asked Catwoman to marry him. The answer is here, and it's spoilers. Yes. Whatever. That's cool. I want to say they got married back in Earth 2 before Crisis on Infinite Earths, when there was like an old version of Batman, because their child was the first Huntress. I know, that's dropping some comic knowledge bombs on y'all. Secondly, Marvel is doing an Old Man Hawkeye comic series, which will serve as a prequel to Old Man Logan. If you ever read Old Man Logan or didn't, it's sort of this post-apocalyptic world where all the supervillains got together and took over America, at least. And Hawkeye transports Logan, now an old man who refuses to pop his claws or engage in violence, across the country. So they go through all these territories run by different supervillains And Hawkeye is blind by this point, but is still is amazing an archer. He has Daredevil-like hearing now and knows exactly where people are from the sounds that they make. And so he's still a good archer and can drive the car, which is the spider buggy, which is fun. So anyway, they're going to be telling a story which basically recaps what happened before the start of that story. So I think we're going to get a more in-depth look at, I think, the war between all of the superheroes and all of the supervillains. If you are an X-Men fan, there are a couple new X-Men titles that are becoming our way. One is Legion, I'm guessing because of the popularity of the TV show. And then there's going to be a Gambit and Rogue, or maybe it's Rogue and Gambit. I'm guessing Gambit and Rogue because sexism. But that's coming as well. So I think with this whole Marvel Legacy thing, they're also going to try and pull in some of that 90s nostalgia for the X-Men cartoon and put Gambit and Rogue together in their own comic book. Lastly, and I didn't source where specifically this was when I wrote this down, but somebody stole like $300,000 worth of graded comic books, and I want to say that was in Canada. And I saw that on comicbook.com, and they actually listed the different comics, and it's a really impressive collection. They're almost all of them are graded, which, whatever, I get why people do it, but comics are meant to be read, kids. But there's an Amazing Fantasy 15 in there, which is the first appearance of Spider-Man. A couple different copies of Incredible Hulk 181, which is the first appearance of Wolverine. Clearly some things. But because they are sealed in these cases, that means that each of them has their own serial number, which means they are easier to track. So I don't know if there's some underground black market comic book thing going on, but we will assume not. We will hope not. I hope there's not people, maybe a first issue of Spider-Man, you'd have somebody who'd think that's cool. That's not necessarily a comic book fan, but all right, that's news. So let us, boy, that felt pretty quick. That's okay. Let's take a quick break and we will be right back.
Hey everyone, I'm Katie.
And I'm Chelsea, and we're the hosts of the podcast
Tea Time with Katie and Chelsea.
We are two best friends who love pop culture. We try to have a female perspective on things, but we really just talk about anything we like. What are some recent topics we've done, Katie?
Well, we've talked about girl power songs, Wonder Woman, Veronica Mars, young adult fiction novels, San Diego Comic-Con, and so much more. So grab your cup of tea or whatever your drink of choice is and download our podcast on iTunes or Stitcher and start listening today.
And we are back. We are part of the Geek to Geek podcast network. Please love us. I'll give you info in the show notes and at the end of the show of where all you can find us. But as always, we just like to say, please listen to our shows. Please give us ratings and reviews, especially on iTunes. We currently have 21 reviews on there. Thank you, everybody, for reviewing and giving star ratings and subscribing to the show. It really does mean the world to me in particular, I know, because when I go and I get to look at the statistics and I get to see, you know, how many people get the show and like the next day, I assume is usually a good idea of how many people are subscribed. And seeing that number tick up very slowly since starting has been really rewarding and gives me a reason to keep going. Like, I'm going to talk about comics anyway, but I like that I'm talking about comics to people who I assume care about listening about comics. Otherwise, it's just me talking at the wife or friends that don't read comic books, and they get sick of me after a while. All right, let's get into our topic of the week. That's too happy, isn't it? It should be like da-dum, 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 boom, da-dum, bum, da-dum, bum, bum, da-dum, bop, da-dum, 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 dum, dum, boom, da-dum, da-dum, boom, da-dum, bum, boom. That was my version of the theme from John Carpenter's Halloween. Thank you. Thank you. Tip your waitress. Tip your waitress here all week. Thank you. All right, I wanted to talk about horror comics, and specifically ones based on movies. I was hoping to have someone to talk to about that in the form of Liam, but that's okay. Let's first start with just some other general horror comic books. I want to say that I never got into the classics, you know, the Tales from the Crypt comic books, the Tales from the Dark Side, the all the old comics from the 50s and 60s that had titles like, Scare and Thrill and Chilling Tales and stuff. I never got into those comics. Certainly as a kid, that's nothing my parents would ever allow me to have. And I didn't even really know they existed. Or if I did, it was only in this peripheral, like, old comics. They sort of sat in the same category as maybe Western comics to me growing up as a kid. So it was really quite a while before I actually got introduced to them. And for the most part, it was in the form of comic books based on movies that I had seen. Now, I also wasn't a huge horror movie fan. I remember the first horror films I saw was at my uncle's house, and I must have been like 7 or 8. So bless that man for being awful enough to do this, or wonderful enough to do this. We watched some of the old 1950s horror films like, what was it, Them, where it's the giant ants, and then the original 1950s, The Blob. But then he showed us Alien, and I think Aliens. We stayed up late. It was a night my brothers and I stayed at my uncle's house. And it is the only time I can remember having a nightmare. Now, I'm sure I've had them before, but this is the first time I ever remember having a waking nightmare where I could have sworn that there was a facehugger crawling along the end of the bed. So you have to picture being like a 7-year-old kid and you're half awake at night and you're just thinking about the movies and you're enjoying them because you're not used to this idea of films intended to scare you, made for that explicit purpose. And then imagining this creepy crawly thing skittering across the bottom of the bed. I remember getting out of bed and like walking around the room a couple of times before I'm sure eventually I went back to bed. But after that, I didn't have a whole lot of exposure to horror films. I remember seeing Darkman because I remember one of my brothers had a nightmare after that one, but I loved the idea. I loved the idea of Darkman. It's a film directed by Sam Raimi where Liam Neeson plays the main character, and basically his face gets burned off in an accident, so he learns to make fake skin that only lasts, an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is, and tries to exact revenge on the people who injured him while pretending to be other people. It's a pretty cool premise. But it really wasn't until my friend Sebastian introduced me to the Evil Dead movies in middle school. Would have been around 8th grade or 9th grade, and that was really my first fandom. Like, I was always a big fan of comic books, but I never engaged in a fandom elsewhere. I didn't go talk to other people about comics. It was just a thing that I liked that nobody else I knew was into. But once the Evil Dead showed up, this was also the age of early AOL 56K internet, for me anyway. The movies came out in the early 80s, and, well, okay, I won't get into it. This isn't an Evil Dead podcast. The point I'm making is I got on a forum for the first time and was every day talking to people about the Evil Dead movies. And I absolutely loved it. It was my first taste of what a communal geekdom could be all about. And I've been hooked on that idea ever since. So when it came to comic books that were horror themed, some of my first were actually the ones based on the Evil Dead franchise. There are the Army of Darkness comic books that came out in like the 2000s at some point. Was it mid-2000s or even closer to 2010? It really was a while. And there have been times where I had a couple of horror comics, one in particular that I'll get to before that. But in general, like, that was it. It was because it was an established property that I already liked. And it was reading as a continuation. But now the problem with that franchise in particular, and I imagine this probably goes for other horror franchises as well, is if they're split with titles like Army of Darkness and Evil Dead, even though Army of Darkness is technically Evil Dead 3, they're owned by different companies. So you will see comic books and merchandise advertising Army of Darkness and advertising Evil Dead or Evil Dead 2 completely separate. And now there's comic books based on both of them, and I had to drop off. I was enjoying the Army of Darkness comics, but now here's Evil Dead comics that sort of tell a continuation of that. And I can't keep up with everything. Plus you have the video games, which sometimes they say are continuations of the story in canon. And of course they never really are because somebody else is going to write something completely unconnected. And now we have the Ash vs. Evil Dead television show, which I did buy the Blu-rays for. So I haven't seen it yet. It's not part of my geekery unless you count buying stuff geekery. But I bought Season 1 and 2 on Blu-ray, and I've seen Season 1, but I'm really pumped for Season 2. But that is part of my frustration with horror comics that are based on other properties. Besides that, I have comic books based on the Underworld franchise. I have... Well, let's just get into it. I keep walking around it. My favorite horror comic of all time, single issue, is an issue based on Halloween, or I think there was Halloween and then Halloween 2. And I'm trying to remember, I didn't go grab the issue out of my long box. I believe it was the same company that put out like the Lady Death and Evil Ernie comics, and for whatever reason I can't think of the name of that publisher. But it told the story of Michael Myers coming back, and I feel like it took place after Halloween H2O, which is the film where Jamie Lee Curtis returns to the franchise, and in the end, spoilers, everybody, kills Michael Myers by cutting his head off with an axe. Now, in the films, they later followed that up with a movie called Halloween Resurrection, where you found out that, oh God, what was it? It was something like Michael Myers took off his entire outfit and mask, taped somebody else's mouth shut, put them in the outfit, and apparently that's the one that went after and got killed by Laurie Strode at the end of Halloween H2O. It was just one of those ridiculous, nope, retcon, he's really still alive, so we can continue. And then I believe they kill Laurie Strode in it. So the fact that they're saying Jamie Lee Curtis is returning to the franchise is confusing. But I think it's because they're going to try and kind of do what some of these other, like the Terminator franchise keeps doing, where they're like, we're going to ignore the sequels and we're just going to continue our story from the first or second movie. In any case, what I loved about this comic was the plot twist that it did. So major spoilers here, but it's the reason I liked it so much. I was never a big Halloween fan. I've seen the first one, I've seen H2O, and maybe I've seen one of the other ones somewhere in the middle or parts of them. But I was never a big Michael Myers guy. I always preferred the idea of Freddy Krueger over Michael Myers. But this comic completely changed it. It talked about the history of the town of Haddonfield, Illinois, where back when it was a small village, they were burning witches, and someone who was being burned put a spell, put a curse on, it was either their family or her own family, where every couple generations someone would return and they would be evil, or through somebody's lineage their family would be cursed. And so the idea is Michael Myers, this child who was born and was already pure evil, is due to this curse. So they give you kind of an origin story for him, instead of just there was a child and he had nothing, no emotions, his eyes were blank, there was nothing but evil in that child. So they gave you a bit of an origin story, but then the awesome one, post H2O, spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Michael Myers is still dead. It follows around Laurie Strode, kind of like in H2O, where she's seeing flashes of Michael Myers because she can't get him out of her head. But the big reveal in the end is Laurie Strode, unbeknownst to herself, becomes the new Michael Myers and is not superhumanly strong or anything like that. So eventually when she gets injured, that's when they find out and pull the mask off. And by this point, she's, missing an eye and she's all beat up because people assumed it was Michael Myers. And that idea that she had to become this thing in order to keep surviving. She had to split off that fear and realize it by physically becoming Michael Myers. And I thought that was such a good way of continuing the story, especially from the original ones, because she was the original sort of victim, or whatever. The original victim is Michael Myers' sister, and we find out Laurie Strode is another sister, and that's why he goes after her. But the point I'm making, she was the original sort of sole survivor in the first film. Now, beyond that, as far as comics based on movies, I have read there was a Wildstorm put out a Nightmare on Elm Street series called, I think it was The Dream Warriors or The Dream something or other, and it was just sort of yet another retelling of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. It was set within that continuity of it's another generation of kids, and I thought that was pretty good and the art was good. But a big problem I have with horror comics is there's no jump scares. And that's not to say that jump scares are the end-all be-all of horror films. I prefer psychological thrillers and slow burns. Give me a couple jumps in there just to keep things moving along. But I'm totally in it for a great story, and horror films allow you to do twists and turns that a regular, even a drama, and certainly a comedy, wouldn't let you do. You don't get to kill your main character. You don't get to do, these horrible things. And I think that's why Game of Thrones became so popular, is main characters would die. You never knew who was going to live. So I feel like some of that is gone in comic books. So you really have to try and tell me a good story. And that's where we come to Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. Supposedly, this was a proposed sequel to the Freddy vs. Jason movie. is they were going to bring back Bruce Campbell as Ash. And everyone was talking about an Evil Dead 4 for decades, and they kept being told, not going to happen, not going to happen. They gave us a remake. You're never going to see Bruce Campbell as Ash again. There was no talk about a television show. And so there was this theory that there might be a sequel to Freddy vs. Jason with Ash in it. It didn't happen, but they ended up making a comic book out of it. And I don't know if this was based on any type of original screenplay anywhere, because I didn't look it up, or if it was just somebody decided to make a comic. But it was written as a continuation of the Army of Darkness comic books at the time, I believe, because they did a bunch of miniseries, that sent Ash flying through time in different dimensions, fighting different things. And then in one of them, he ends up in the Freddy vs. Ash universe and has to fight against both of them. I'm never a big fan of comic writers who just regurgitate lines from movies and pretending that they're giving you something new. So when Ash just keeps saying things that are very Ash with no character development because they're trying to bring back that sense of nostalgia, right? So the way I remember it, I haven't reread it yet this Halloween season, is it was okay. I mean, it wasn't great, but it's the closest you're going to get. So if that was a thing you always wanted to see as a horror fan, it is out there in comic book form. Beyond that, the main series that I want to focus on that I enjoy, one is Locke and Key, which I've mentioned on this podcast before. It deals with a group of children who move into the family's house. What's the way of putting that? It's the house the family has been in for generations. And when their father is murdered, they move with their mother into this house that their uncle was living in. And it is called Key House in the town of Lovecraft. And it's this huge mansion. And hidden in this mansion are a bunch of keys. And each of these keys has its own magical property and unlocks a special lock somewhere or something and does something incredible. So it's half fairy tale, half horror story, which, let's face it, most original fairy tales were. And they gain these incredible abilities and go on incredible adventures. But this whole time, there's the idea of where these keys came from and why there's a locked door deep in the caves beneath the house that is shaped like the Omega symbol and what is hidden behind it. And meanwhile, one of the people who killed these kids' fathers is slowly murdering his way to Lovecraft in order to free evil spirits and murder the family. And so there's this nice interweaving, and that's why they've tried to make it a TV show like twice, because there's this nice balance of it's a horror show, but there's also a lot of heart in it. The other series that I would recommend for horror fans out there is the one I just finished rereading. I was planning on doing like a month-long reread of this series called Rachel Rising, which is written and illustrated by Terry Moore, the person who, I suppose, maybe more recognizably did Strangers in Paradise, which is a fairly popular independent comic book. I got hooked on Rachel Rising because I kept seeing all these reviews of it being spooky and wonderful, and it was, you know what, I need a good horror comic. I hadn't read one in a while, so I started picking up Rachel Rising. It's such a fascinating read. It reads nice and quick, but the art is very good. Terry Moore is a very talented artist, and the story just keeps developing and layers keep getting peeled back. The main conceit of the story is a woman is murdered and then wakes up, and it kind of goes from there, and you find out who she is really, why she was able to wake up, why her best friend also gets killed in a car accident is able to wake up. And it's so hard to talk about the series without giving out spoilers. It starts getting almost biblical, I guess we'll say, in nature, and it's an almost all-female cast, which is great. I think all the characters are handled really well. It reads like a really good horror television show in that there's character development, there's new plot revelations, and it goes along at a decent pace, and it's very well written. And there's humor in there as well. There's humor intermixed. There's this little girl who may not be that much of a little girl. Everything's spoilers for this thing. But yes, there's a little girl who might like to kill people and might actually be funny for it, sort of, when it's not really dark. It is not a comedy book. It's not like a Giant Days kind of thing. It is definitely a horror, drama, mystery, suspense story. But it is really good. And if you're a fan of female-led comics or comics that are mostly female characters and you don't mind horror elements, that might be one that you would want to check out. I would say not one for kids, still a good read. So there are 42 issues. My game plan was to slowly read it, and I binged it in like 2 days. Like, I just got hooked on it. That's why that was like my weekly geekery for the whole week, is mostly what I've been doing with my free time was reading Rachel Rising. Maybe it was a little more in 2 days. I'm trying to think if there are any other horror series out there that I really enjoyed. I read the first volume of Witches a while back, which was not bad, certainly. It has some very interesting artwork. I have read The Walking Dead, obviously, which I guess, yes, it's horror because people die. So obviously there's The Walking Dead out there. I suppose that's the big one. And keep in mind, that is not an adaptation of the TV show. It is the other way around. The TV show is based on the comic. And I'm sure that I am missing others. I know I have the original Alien vs. Predator comic book, which, by the way, nice little slide into adaptation territory. The original Alien vs. Predator comic was written after the first Predator film, but before the second one, which is why at the end of the second film, you see the skull of an alien in their ship, which set up this whole, who are they going to do a crossover? It was because they actually already had, because Dark Horse Comics owned the rights to both of them and said, well, why don't we just do a crossover? And it's actually a really good story. And the original Alien vs. Predator movie took kind of pieces out of the story, except that movie took place on Earth and wasn't very good. Where the comic is actually excellent. It takes place on another planet where they find out there's an alien infestation, and the predators show up as sort of this rite of passage where they have to hunt down and kill these variations on the xenomorph alien creature. And this woman who ends up, spoilers, everything spoilers, woman who ends up being respected by them for also being able to kill aliens along with them. I also have the Green Lantern Aliens crossover, which features, I believe, both Hal Jordan and Kyle Rayner. I don't know if Alan Scott is in there, the Golden Age Green Lantern. But it's sort of split on these different tales where they encounter these aliens, and sort of the difference, I believe, if I remember right, between the way Hal Jordan tries to deal with them, which is wiping them out, and Kyle Rayner, who eventually takes some of the aliens because it's still alien life and he doesn't want to kill them, and I believe he leaves them on Mogo, which is the planet-sized Green Lantern, or the Green Lantern who is a planet, which really doesn't work out in the current continuity because Mogo is the base for the Green Lantern Corps, so they would all very much, I think, be dead. Or you'd have a xenomorph Green Lantern, because I imagine they have the ability to overcome great fear, and that would be fairly wonderful. There's also, of course, comics out there, the Doctor Strange and the Ghost Riders of the world. I never really got into those, so I think as far as those adaptations go, as far as my suggestions for you guys this week, I apologize if this feels like a really short episode, but I would say Rachel Rising, if you're an adult and you like a female-led horror story that isn't female victims. It's not the I'm terrified and I'm running away type of thing. Lock and Key is one of my favorite comic book series of all time. You do have to push through the first volume. There's stuff in the first volume that I normally would not be a fan of in my comic books. Just trigger warning kind of content, I guess. And once you get through that and get into some of the other story, I mean, there are sexual themes, dark sexual themes and stuff that run through it, but the majority of the story, I would feel, isn't that so much. And it's good. It's written by Joe Hill, who is Stephen King's son, but he didn't want to have to bank off the popularity of the King name. So he is Joe Hill. And it's illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez. That's very good. Haha, I knew that off the top of my head. I feel like there's something that I'm forgetting. I feel like there is a horror comic that I have read that I really enjoyed, but for whatever reason, it is not coming to me. And there's a lot of comics out there, I think, that are sort of borderline horror, but are really, might just have some scarier issues. I mean, there's books like American Vampire, which I read a couple volumes of, which I thought was fine, but it didn't feel like a horror comic. There's Bite Club, another vampire comic that didn't quite feel like it. There are the books based on Vampire the Masquerade, or rather the comic books based on Vampire the Masquerade. I do own all of those because I'm a bit of a vampire fan. And I suppose some of those qualify as horror stories, but they're not the main things that I would send people out to read. The problem is I don't know where I would send people to go out and find those Halloween books, because it was literally 2 single issues, if I remember right. I was just that impressed with the story, but I already spoiled it for you. So I think Rachel Rising and Lock and Key are probably my big suggestions for horror-themed comic books. But, of course, as always, I want to know what you guys think. So you need to tell me, are there comic books out there that are horror-themed I absolutely must read? Are there comic books based on movies that are actually worthwhile? So I want to know what you guys think, because there's all sorts of different comics out there. Some of them are just straight up gory and ridiculous. Some of them actually tell very gripping stories. I probably would be looking for somewhere in between or more on the story side. I don't need a ton of gore in my comics to impress me. As impressive as the art is, that's usually not why I'm there for a horror story. I want something that's going to draw me in, like Rachel Rising, that just, keeps me turning pages. So I think that's it. I think that's it for this week. We're going to go into the end of the show with the ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-da-ba-do-do-do-do. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. Woo! Nightmare on Elm Street. That is going to be it for this week, you guys. We're going to close the comic box. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, apologies if this feels like a weird, short, truncated episode, but I want to make sure I always get an episode out each week for you guys. If you want to make any more suggestions, tell me how awful of an episode this was, or if you have ideas for more things. I want to keep going with this Halloween theme for the rest of the month. If there's something you really want to hear about related to horror and comic books, hit me up on Twitter. We are on Twitter at ComicBoxCast. I am on Twitter personally at Nobi. You can email us at thecomicboxpodcast@gmail.com, or the Geek to Geek podcast is everywhere. So you can find us on Reddit, Comic Box Cast, on Facebook, Comic Box Cast. We have a Slack channel chat, big group chat thing with everybody in all of the shows. You can get an invitation to that at slack.geektogeekcast.com. And of course, the website geektogeekcast.com has information on all of our shows. So please listen to all of the great shows on our network. And we will see you guys next week for some more spooky goodness. Spooky, spooky, evil. That's my Abraham Simpson, Grandpa Simpson joke from the episode where they had the comic box. We're getting into Halloween, talking spooky stuff. Spooky stuff. All right, I'm done now.
I'm Void.
And I'm Beej.
And together, we're the Geek to Geek podcast. Well, we make it. It is kind of us, but I guess it's separate.
Every week, we pick a topic from geek or digital culture and chat about it for a while.
And you're invited. We talk about books and movies, games, comics, the internet.
Or really whatever we feel like.
Yeah, that too.
So look for the Geek to Geek podcast on iTunes.
Or wherever your podcasts are sold. Or downloaded. Or whatever.
Hi, my name is Joe Hogan, and I'm a geek. And if you're currently listening to this, there's a good chance you're a geek too. So check out my podcast, Geektitude. Each week, I talk with somebody about their geek aptitude. Sometimes I talk to people in a geeky profession. Sometimes it's someone doing something really cool with their geekiness. Often it's another geeky podcaster. But it's always someone who wants to share their inner geek. So join me each week as we come together to geek out about all the geeky stuff we love. And remember, this week, keep it geek.